Hey everybody. Today we're going to talk about the experience of loss and what the research shows in understanding the experience of loss. The paradox of this topic, of this aspect of death, dying, and bereavement, is that loss is clearly unique and individualized and not the same as any other person's experience of loss. And at the same time, it is not a willy-nilly, simplistic reaction to the loss of someone or something we loved. There's actually some predictable cycles, some patterns, and some reactions and responses and adaptive processes that are very common to the experience of loss. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So first, let's do some definitions, because this is often confusing to people. It was for me. But we know that there's bereavement, grief, and mourning, and they're not all the same things. Bereavement is really defined as the objective event of the loss, and it conveys a sense of deprivation, meaning that some part of ourselves has been stripped away against our will, and we're bereaved. It's the objective event of the loss. Grief, on the other hand, is the actual reaction to loss. There's no one right or universal way to experience and respond to loss, and grief is highly variable. It accompanies thoughts and feelings as well as physical and body stuff, behavioral and spiritual responses. Versus mourning is not so much the reaction to loss, that's grief, but rather to the process by which a bereaved person integrates the loss into her ongoing life. So bereavement, grief, and mourning. So working through grief, we look at several models. One of them is attachment theory. And in attachment theory, it's when a person recognizes that someone loved, to which he or she was attached, no longer exists. And grief arises along with a host of psychological defenses to withdraw the energy from that person because they can no longer reciprocate. They're dead. And this demand to withdraw energy is likely to meet with resistance. And in a Kubler-Ross type of way, it really mirrors some of the stages of grief. We'll talk about her theory in a bit. And it causes the survivor to temporarily turn away from reality in an attempt to cling to what was lost, either through denial, bargaining, anger, what have you. And as the grief continues, the energy previously invested eventually becomes detached from the person who died, and the ego, the personality of the survivor, is freed from its attachment so that new relationships can be formed. Now, a note here is that when you say the ego is freed from its attachment to the deceased, it doesn't mean that erasing the existence and the fulfillment of the survivor's life having been with the person who's now deceased. It doesn't mean, it's not intended to minimize the experience the survivor had while the deceased was alive with them. It just means that there's a process in attachment theory of letting go, never forgetting the involvement in the memories of the deceased person, but letting go so that there's some room to continue on with life in some changed, but in some fashion. So Freud wrote a seminal work, which actually is still used today by grief and death studies. It was called, in 1917, it was a paper called On Murder, Mourning, and Melancholia. And you can see that the book cover can look like these other versions. And the central message from this first grief work, if you will, it's the perspective that the idea of that the bereaved must somehow adjust to the affectionate bonds of attachment to the deceased by gradually working through these attachments. That was the initial premise. No one was talking about this stuff prior to 1917. But that was the idea, this process of adjusting, of integrating the loss into your current life. And in the grief work model, it's really important to note that any grief model can only approximate the complexity of loss. So the concept of working through grief advances a couple of points to consider in thinking about grief and mourning. One, it describes grief as an adaptive process to loss, not depression. That's a clinical diagnostic area. But an adaptive response to loss is part of the grief work model. And it states that the reality of the loss has to ultimately be confronted and accepted. Not quickly and not hurry up so we can get on with stuff. No, but ultimately confronted and accepted. And then thirdly, grief work models acknowledge that grieving is an active process that occurs over a period of time. You have better days than others initially, and then you have a little bit longer time of less sadness, and then, so on and so forth, to ultimately come to integrate the loss into your ongoing life. Then Strobe and Schutt, other psychologists, social psychologists, they proposed a dual process model in understanding how people cope with loss. And it states that the bereaved person experiences and expresses both loss-oriented and restoration-oriented coping behaviors that oscillate between these two dynamics. It's back and forth between loss-oriented and restoration, experiencing and dealing with the loss, the reality of the loss, and trying to integrate that and rebuild your life in some way. And so this dual process model of coping by Strobe and Schutt was very innovative for the time. Loss-oriented, for an example, that type of coping includes the yearning for the deceased. You miss them. It's crying about their death. It includes looking at old photographs, cherishing memories, whereas restoration-oriented coping includes mastering the tasks that had been taken care of by the deceased. And typically these might be household budgeting and home repairs and finances, going back to old organizations and civic groups or community meetings that the two or you or the family went to, and now it's very different because the person's deceased. But that's restoration-oriented coping skills, dealing with the tasks that had been previously associated with the person who deceased. So here's the illustration real quickly of the dual process model of Strobe and Schutt. And you can see loss-oriented and restoration-oriented coping skills and how they go back and forth, particularly in the early adjustment phases of loss. Then the integrated model of grief proposed by Cole and Murray Parks looked at a phases of grief model and extended really from the attachment theory premise initially. And it takes into account the person's own history, their own experiences, and their own, in particular, the relationship they had with the deceased. And following the bereavement depending on the circumstances and the individual. And there are 4 phases, which are shock and numbness, yearning and searching, disorientation and disorganization, reorganization, and resolution. And Murray Parks points to 3 main influences on a person's course of grieving. 1, the urge to look back, to cry, to search for what is lost. 2, the urge to look forward, explore the world that emerges out of the loss, and to discover what can be carried forward from the past into the future. And thirdly, the social and cultural pressures that influence how the first 2 triggers are inhibited or expressed. Kubler-Ross, one of the foremost figures in studying grief and loss, introduced the 5 stages of grief. Now, these 5 stages don't occur linear in a nice, neat, orderly row of responses to loss. No, they're kind of all over the place. It could be denial 1 week or month, and then into depression, and then over to anger, and then back to denial. There's 5 distinct stages according to Kubler-Ross, but they don't necessarily occur linearly. Okay, so the first stage is denial. You can't just come to terms with the person's actually gone. There's no way. Then there's anger. Why is this happening to me? And why did the person leave me? And bargaining, usually to a deity, depression, and acceptance, ultimately. And ultimately, through this Kubler-Ross stage-based model, through grief work, the person ultimately gets to acceptance, which is not forgetting the person. It's just coming to terms with the emotional pain of loss-oriented emotional pain and distress into beginning the process of restoration. Then there's complications of grief. Our book talks about Rando, another social psychologist, who looked at the following as examples of situations that heighten the risk of what she termed complicated mourning. Sudden, unanticipated death, especially when it's traumatic, violent, mutilating, or random. Death of a child, complicated grief. The bereaved person's perception that the death was somehow preventable, i.e. in suicide. A relationship between the bereaved and the deceased that was markedly angry or ambivalent or markedly dependent. And the bereaved's perceived lack of any social support can produce or result in what Rando calls complicated mourning. And mode of death is how a person died will really affect the survivor's grief, such as, for an example, or such as anticipated death, which is the phenomena of anticipatory grief or anticipatory mourning, and it can be understood as a reaction to the awareness of an impending loss, such as a loved one, a grandparent, or a sibling who has a terminal illness and maybe is in hospice. And actually, hospice works with anticipatory death because you know the days are numbered from the loved one. And then there's sudden death, such as the survivors who are bereft because of a sudden death want information to help them begin to make sense of the loss. There's suicide, which we'll talk a lot more in Chapter 12, but just in terms of a mode of death, suicide, where people who survive a loved one's suicide are often left feeling bewildered. And the impact of the suicide can really intensify the survivor's feelings of blame and guilt. Homicide, when a loved one dies as a victim of a homicide, the survivor often experiences the world as a dangerous and cruel and unsafe and unfair. And trigger events can re-stimulate grief in homicide mode of death. So very similar to PTSD. Disasters such as COVID, earthquakes, hurricanes, other pandemics such as AIDS and others, in which others died, become survivors twice over. Survivors of a catastrophic event that could have ended their own lives and survivors of deaths of others, often friends or relatives, also leads to survivor's guilt. And being alive while others died can be hard to cope with. Grief counseling and therapy works really well, but as long as the counselor is death competent. It's not just a counselor, it's not just a therapist, but are they death competent? Because remember, going through grieving reaction is not depression. It's not to be treated like depressive illness. And I even say that grief, while similar to depression, is very different. It often occurs as a reaction to the loss of an important relationship. But there's a difference. Depressed persons regard themselves as worthless. And so death competent counselors really understand the process of coping, the staged-based reactions to loss, and to facilitate gentle changes along the way while the person's adapting and integrating. Grief counseling does a lot of good. There's a lot of research on outcomes, and there is no foundation for claims that grief therapy or counseling is ineffective or harmful. Grief can ultimately be unifying, by the way, rather than alienating human experience. And people who are in grief often describe themselves as stronger, more competent, more mature, and more independent, better able to face other crises of life, ultimately. And I like to leave with a saying from Maya Angelou. She said, "When great souls die, after a period, peace blooms, slowly and always, irregularly. Space is filled with a kind of soothing electric vibration. Our senses restored, never to be the same, whisper to us, they existed. They existed. We can be and be better, for they existed." And this is just to let us know that the existence of the absent, let that inspire us. Okay,